Hello, Bible readers. It's our second day in Genesis, and I'm still trying to sort out how exactly do we go through this together. And I think how we're going to find this works is we're going to split Genesis into really 4 parts. And this first part, chapter 1 through chapter 11, really up until the promise God makes to Abram, it's really section 1. And we're going to spend some time on it because it's definitely worth our time. I'm not sure we're even going to be able to cover it in these first couple weeks. But let's see how this works. So I know you journaled some things about chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 4, and I want us to use those toward the end of this week. I'll say more about that at the end of my 5 minutes here. But yesterday I was talking about how God calls creation into being, calls the church into being, both with a spoken word. At the heart of this understanding of Genesis as a bunch of stories about God's call, which creates the world and then the church, is that within God's call is promise. Again, a lot of this might be like, well, duh, of course, but actually we need to say the obvious things, and that is that there is promise within these calls. The first 11 chapters lead into the primary promise made to Abram, and then everything in Genesis after chapter 12 is rooted in God's promise to provide Abram with land, descendants, and to be eventually Israel's God, which will be a blessing eventually to the whole world. So the first day is really about call, about how God calls things into being. This day I'm talking about the promise at the core of those calls. The promise is from God to stay with God's called partner until God's way is fully accomplished. That's the promise. God's going to stay with God's partner until the way is accomplished. The partner, Israel, is simply called to rely on God's promise and only on God's promise. What, of course, makes all the stories interesting in these 11 chapters and beyond is to see how each party deals with the promise. How does God deal with God's promise? How does creation and how does Israel, how do the people of God deal with God's promise? If we only read Genesis, and this is a hard kind of imaginative thing to do, if we only read Genesis and didn't know anything about what happens after, we wouldn't know how will God react to him or her or them this time. Is this the tipping point for God's faithfulness? Like, is this when God's going to say, I'm out? And we also, if we only read Genesis, we'd have no way of knowing whether God's promised people will be faithful to God's promise, relying only on him, or won't be. As Brueggemann says, each text is an invitation to faithfulness and an exploration of the risks and temptations that accompany faithfulness. Now that speaks to our now. I don't know about you, but without the rest of the Bible, Genesis feels like a suspenseful thriller, is what Brueggemann is saying, because you don't know how's this going to end. Knowing how it all goes tempers our responses as readers in 2021. Knowing that there will be Jesus, that there will be resurrection, all that kind of thing, it makes us see and hear and read Genesis in a way that's less suspenseful. But Genesis all by itself, if you only had it, well, it reads like our lives. Each moment of each day is an invitation to faithfulness and an exploration of the risks and temptations that accompany faithfulness. That's an interesting way to think about our lives, right? Genesis always feels more like a conversation partner to me than an answer book, more mystical than scientific. And so to get at that, I want to talk about how Brueggemann talks about story. Here's what he says about story. Story is not interested in deep structures, abiding truths, or exact proofs. Story does not trade in eternal realities. And I want you to think about this in terms of when you tell a story about something that happened long ago to someone else to explain something about yourself or someone you know. Like when you tell a story, you're not trying to offer an eternal reality. Thus, our study will avoid all the solidness which appeals to myth or the proof that history relies on. Story offers nothing that's absolutely certain. Whoa, that's a big claim. Because we go to the Bible hoping to find things that are absolutely certain. And Brueggemann is saying that's just not what story does. Story lives, rather, by the scandal of concreteness, by the freedom of imagination, and by the passion of hearing. Story has its own rules, doesn't it? It is concrete in telling about real people in a specific time and place who engaged in irreversible events. It's freely imaginative. The story can be told in more than one way. It has more than one meaning, depending on the way it's told and the way it's heard. The hearing must be done with passion. The listening community knows that the events now being presented may matter as much to us as to the original participants. These stories are not timeless, but they're in time. There is a coincidence, so that the events of another time may loom with authority in our present time. Thus, the old concrete events may intrude upon and transform our events. Story is concrete and particular, as is every good promise, but stories are also open-ended. And so the point I wanted to make by reading that, I know it's a lot, but open-ended is where Scripture starts in Genesis. It's not a series of answers or science or history, and I think that is very good, to start from a broad place of open-endedness. So for tomorrow, scan Genesis 2:4 through 11:29. They call that the prehistory. And tomorrow I'm going to outline this whole prehistory before getting into smaller bits starting on Thursday. Might take me till Friday. We'll see how it goes. But for the whole section, from 2:4, really from chapter 1 through 11:29, journal what your big questions are about this section, and then feel free to email them to me, and I'll take some time beyond 5 minutes to speak to the questions that are rising up in these first 11 chapters, and that'll be the ground that we'll use maybe next week as we go into our particular chapters next week. We're gonna spend 2 weeks on these first 11 chapters. All right, go in peace, serve the Lord.